Hi, listener. This is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ideological doctrine and ego in favor of meaning, purpose, and unity as a whole. All right, so today I'm going to finish off reading from Synchronicity and Acausal Connecting Principle by C.G. Jung. Where we were before was it's talking about people being in a state of coma and having out-of-body experiences. So when there's this woman, she's had birth, I think, and she's bled a lot, so she's in she's kind of out of it or something. Maybe she's having an out-of-body experience, I'm not sure. Anyway, so when the doctor, her mother, and her husband had gone, and everything was cleared up, the nurse wanted to eat, and the patient saw her turn around at the door and ask, "Do you want anything before I go to supper?" She tried to answer, but couldn't. She had a feeling that she was sinking through the bed into a bottomless void. She saw the nurse hurry to the bedside and seize her hand in order to get a pulse. From the way she moved her fingers to and fro, the patient thought it might be almost imperceptible. Yet she herself felt quite all right. She was slightly amused at the nurse's alarm. She was not in the least frightened. That was the last she could remember for a long time. The next thing she was aware of was that, without feeling her body and its position, she was looking down from a point in the ceiling and could see everything going on in the room below her. She saw herself lying in the bed, deadly pale, with closed eyes. Beside stood the nurse. The doctor paced up and down the room excitedly, and it seemed to her that he had lost his head and didn't know what to do. Her relatives crowded up to the door. Her mother and her husband came in and looked at her with frightened faces. She told herself it was stupid of them to think that she was going to die, for she'd certainly come round again. All this she knew that behind her was a glorious park-like All this time she knew that behind her was a glorious park-like landscape, shining with the brightest colours, and in the particular, an emerald green meadow with a short grass which sloped gently upward beyond a wrought iron gate leading into the park. It was spring, and the little gay flowers, such as she had never seen before, were scattered about in the grass. The whole domain sparkled in the sunlight, and the colours were of indescribable splendour. The sloping meadow was flanked on both sides by dark green trees. It gave her an impression of a clearing in the forest, never yet trodden by the foot of man. Quote, "I knew that this was the entrance to another world, and that if I turned around to gaze at that picture directly, I should feel tempted to go in at the gate, and thus step out of life." She did not actually see this landscape, as her back was turned to it, but she knew it was there. She felt there was nothing to stop her from entering in the gate. She only knew that she would turn back to her body and would not die. That was why she found the agitation of the doctor and the distress of her relatives stupid and out of place. The next thing that happened was that she awoke from her coma and saw the nurse bending over her bed. She was told she had been unconscious for half an hour. The next day, some 15 hours later, when she felt a little stronger, she made a remark about the nurse about the incompetent and hysterical behavior of the doctor during her coma. The nurse energetically denied this criticism in the belief that the patient had been completely unconscious at the time and could therefore have known nothing of the scene. Only when she described in full detail what had happened during the coma was the nurse obliged to admit that the patient had perceived events exactly as had happened in reality. All right. I remember when I read this the first time, I thought it was like, okay, wow, right? This is amazing. So this is like, experiences like these are in a way evidence for I'm tempted to say dualism, but that's not actually it. Empty for spirituality, mysticism, there being something beyond matter, right? So, and she saw the spirit world. She saw the gateway to the spirit world. But she had a choice, like many others before. However, she had a choice to go back to a body. Now, a lot of cases, people die, they don't have the choice, they're dead, right? But in this case, she did. So she seems to had a choice. But obviously, if the body had died, then she would have had to go through there. One might conjecture that this was simply a psychogenic twilight state in which a split of part of consciousness still continued to function. The patient, however, had never been hysterical and had suffered a genuine heart collapse followed by syncope due to a cerebral anemia, as all the outward and evidently alarming symptoms indicated. She really was in a coma and ought to have been in complete psychic blackout, and being altogether incapable of clear observation and sound judgment. The remarkable thing was that not an immediate perception of the situation was through indirect or unconscious observation, but she saw the whole situation from above. As below, her eyes were in the ceiling, as she put it. Wow, that's the end. That's the Would that be spirit body, energy body, or both combined? I'm under the impression that the spirit body, the energy body being like the chakras, the spirit body being like the soul. If I'm correct, I might not be. Kind of leave the body together and then go to the spirit world together, and then they go to the next life together. That's my impression. Indeed, it is not easy to explain how such unusual, intense psychic processes can take place and be remembered in a state of severe collapse, and how the patient could observe actual events in concrete detail with closed eyes. One would expect such obvious cerebral anemia to militate against or prevent the occurrence of highly complex psychic processes of that kind. So, it's from above. That's, that other body that from above, and it just, well, it seems pretty clear what it is. However, those of a more physicalist perspective might have cognitive dissonance, or simply it won't fit within their paradigm as things stand. So, and that's okay. So Auckland Geddes presents a very similar case before the Royal Medical Society on February 26, 1927. Through here, the ESP went very much further. During a state of collapse, the patient noted the splitting off of an integral consciousness from the body consciousness, the latter gradually resolving itself into organ components. The other consciousness possessed a verifiable ESP. Footnote, cf.g.n.m. Tyrrell's report on the personality of man, London, 1947, page 197. There was another case of this kind on page 199. These experiences seem to show that in swoon states, whereby all human standards, there is every guarantee that conscious activity and sense perception are suspended, consciousness, reproducible ideas, acts of judgment, and perceptions can still continue to exist. The accompanying feeling of levitation, alteration of the angle of vision, and extinction of hearing and of the co-anesthetic perceptions, indicate a shift in the localization of consciousness, a sort of separation from the body, or from the cerebral cortex or cerebrum, which is conjectured to be the seat of conscious phenomena. If we are correct in this assumption, we must ask ourselves whether there is some other nervous substrate in us, apart from the cerebrum, that can think and perceive, or whether the psychic processes that go on in us during loss of consciousness are synchronistic phenomena, i.e. events which have no causal connection with organic processes. I mean, calling it synchronistic, I mean, yes, but at the same time, there's other more mystical explanations than merely calling it synchronicity. This last possibility cannot be rejected out of hand in view of the existence of ESP, i.e. of perceptions independent of space and time, which cannot be explained as processes in the biological substrate. Where sense perceptions are impossible from the start, it can hardly be a question of anything but synchronicity. But where there are spatial and temporal conditions which would make perception and apperception possible in principle, and only the activity of consciousness or the cortical function is extinguished, and where, as in our example, a conscious phenomenon like perception and judgment nevertheless occurs, then the question of a nervous substrate might well be considered. It is well high axiomatic that conscious processes are tied to the cerebrum, and that lower centers contain nothing but chains of reflexes which in themselves are unconscious. This is particularly true of the sympathetic system. Hence, the insects, which have no cerebrospinal nervous system at all, but only a double chain of ganglia, are regarded as reflex automata. This view has recently been challenged by the researchers by which von Frisch of Graz made into the life of bees. It turns out that bees not only tell their comrades by means of a peculiar sort of dance that they have found a feeding place, but they also indicate its direction and distance, thus enabling the beginners to fly to it directly. Footnote, Carl von Frisch, The Dancing Bees, translation by Dora Gils, New York and London, 1954, page 112. This kind of message is no different in principle from information conveyed by a human being. In the latter case, we would certainly regard such behavior as conscious and intentional act. I can hardly imagine how anyone would prove in a court of law that it is taking place unconsciously. Now, that's an interesting point, but they are generally known. My impression from the law of one is that they're second density. Perhaps that's sentience, though. Not sapience, but sort of low-level sentience. We could, at a pinch, admit, on the basis of psychiatric experiences, that objective information can, in exceptional cases, be communicated in a twilight state, but would expressly deny that communications of this kind are normally unconscious. Nevertheless, it would be possible to suppose that in bees the process is unconscious, but that would not help to solve the problem, because we are still faced with the fact that the ganglionic system apparently achieves exactly the same result as our cerebral cortex. Nor is there any proof that bees are unconscious. Thus, we are driven to the conclusion that a nervous substrate like the sympathetic system, which is absolutely different from the cerebrospinal system in the point of origin and function, can evidently produce thoughts and perceptions just as easily as the latter. What then are we to think of the sympathetic system in vertebrates? Can it also produce or transmit specifically psychic processes? Von Frisch's observations prove the existence of transcerebral thought and perception. One must bear this possibility in mind if we want to account for the existence of some form of consciousness during an unconscious coma. During a coma, the sympathetic system is not paralyzed and could therefore be considered a possible carrier of psychic functions. If that is so, then one must ask whether the normal state of unconsciousness and sleep and the potentially unconscious dreams and the potentially conscious dreams it contains can be regarded in the same light. Whether, in other words, dreams are produced not so much by the activity of the sleeping cortex, but by the unsleeping sympathetic system, and are therefore of a transcerebral nature. Well, I will add here that certainly in the case of lucid dreams, we actually make decisions as if it's real, right? And there are people who walk in the night, right? Their muscles, the function in their brain where the muscles are turned off doesn't work, and they can walk around in their sleep. So that seems to indicate that, well, certainly indicates something. Certainly indicates that when we're dreaming, we're actually conscious. So it's funny that the whole term unconscious is perhaps misapplied. Outside of the realm of psychophysical parallelism, which we cannot at present pretend to understand, synchronicity is not a phenomenon whose regularity it is easy to demonstrate. Great. Is there anything else I want to mention? No. One is as much impressed by the disharmony of things as one is surprised by their occasional harmony. In contrast to the idea of pre-established harmony, the synchronistic factor merely claims the existence of an intellectually necessary principle which could be added as a fourth to the recognized triad of space, time, and causality. These factors are necessary but not absolute. Most psychic contents are non-spatial. Time and causality are psychically relative, and in the same way, the synchronistic factor proves to be only conditionally valid. Also, keep in mind, something Jung was aware of at the time as well is space-time is relative. I mean, Einstein established that. That's been known for a long time. So that kind of fits into it. But unlike causality, which reigns despotically over the whole picture of the macroscopic world and the whole universal, and whose universal rule is shattered only in certain lower orders of magnitude, synchronicity is a phenomenon that seems to be primarily connected with psychic conditions, that is to say, processes in the unconscious. What seems to be referred to here is that quantum physics on the micro level seems to be shattering the tendency of causation that we normally get. But synchronicity is something that seems to be, isn't micro, potentially even macro, or at least not micro, and nevertheless seems to not be causal, or at least not causal in the regular sense. And that does challenge the regular scientific paradigm. Synchronistic phenomena are found to occur experimentally with some degree of regularity and frequency in the intuitive magical procedures, where they are subjectively convincing but extremely difficult to verify objectively and cannot be statistically evaluated, at least not at present. On the organic level, it might be possible to regard biological morphogenesis in the light of the synchronistic factor. Also, keep in mind, the reference to intuition is key here, because I do believe that intuition is, well, it's a right brain activity, but fundamentally it's more linked to the activity of the self in some sense. And even though when we've got an ego, we'll still, to varying degrees, use intuition. And the extent to which we can use intuition perhaps might be reflective of our level of consciousness. On the organic level, it might be possible to regard biological morphogenesis in the light of the synchronistic factor. Professor A.M. Dauk of Brussels understands form, despite its tie with matter, as continuity that is superordinate to the living organism. Well, that sounds a little bit Law of One-ish. So James Jeans reckons radioactive decay among the causeless events which, as we have seen, include synchronicity. He says, radioactive breakup appears to be an effect without a cause and suggests that the ultimate laws of nature were not even causal. Well, that's interesting. Physics and Philosophy, Cambridge, 1942, page 127, also page 151. This highly paradoxical formula, coming from the pen of a physicist, is typical of the intellectual dilemma which radioactive decay confronts us. It, or rather, phenomenon of half-life, appears to be an instance of acausal orderliness, a conception which also includes synchronicity, and to which I will revert below. And also consider that our entire understanding, well, not entire, much of our understanding of history is based on carbon dating, which is based on carbon decay. And if that's a synchronistic phenomena, which its cause cannot be ascertained, well, I mean, that has implications on history, doesn't it? Synchronicity is not a philosophical view, but an empirical concept which postulates an intellectually necessary principle. Empirical. I like that it's empirical, because it kind of brings into question certain things in the regular paradigm. And yet, it's not really taken as seriously as perhaps it could be, given that it's empirical. Which also is worth considering that the scientific community has become less empirical than it's reputed to be. It's all right having a scientific method, but if you don't consistently follow it, but you only come down on those who don't follow it when they don't follow it in line with the ideology, but when it isn't followed in line with the ideology, you ignore it. I mean, that's just like, that's just priesthood with extra steps. This cannot be called either materialism or metaphysics. No serious investigator would assert that the nature of what is observed to exist and of that which observes, namely the psyche, are known and recognized quantities. And the latest conclusions of science, if the latest conclusions of science are coming nearer and nearer to a unitary idea of being, characterized by space and time on the one hand, and by causality and synchronicity on the other, that has nothing to do with materialism. Indeed, that seems quite contrary to materialism. Perhaps it almost sounds a bit like Hermeticism or the law of one. Wow, I'm being a bit unnecessarily sarcastic here. Rather, it seems to show that there is some possibility of getting rid of the incommensurability between the observed and the observer. Well, that is something that quantum physics certainly does. And a principle of law of one is that the observer and the observed are one. And that if the observer and the observed, if there's no distinction there between them, then what is observed isn't separate from you. So if you observe something, it's not separate from you. So you are part of it and it's part of you, which means if it's part of you, if you're not separate from it, and there's this idea in Jungian psychology of the self, it's even linked in terms of archetype with it's kind of linked with a child, but a God, Star Child or something, or not Star Child. That's me referring to 40K. I didn't mean to do that. Okay, Jung refers to archetypes. Apparently, it's linked with like the Christ child sort of thing, or God in a sense, which is again you could link in with the law of one. But Jung obviously wasn't talking about that. But what's interesting here is the unity of being. Okay, the observer and the observed. If you look at quantum physics, if you look at string theory, if you look at the law of attraction. Well, this seems to suggest the law of attraction. To me, it seems to line up with it at the very least. This is all about piecing together the puzzle pieces. And that's how we can understand things. We understand things holistically. It's like we've got lots of clues and we're investigators. And we want to present, be able to present to people a picture of reality that is plausible to them, subjectively that is, and yet isn't, on one hand, can't be easily dismissed scientifically, you know, but on the other hand, is actually mystical in nature, at least to some extent. And I feel like it's things like this that really are valuable clues, I would say, or puzzle pieces, whatever you call them. I think it's good to take note of things like this. Anyway, the result in that case would be a unity of being, which would have to be expressed in terms of a new conceptual language, a neutral language, as W. Pauli once called it, one of the prominent early quantum physicists. Space, time, and causality, the triad of quantum physics, would then have to be supplemented by the synchronicity factor and become a tetrad, a quaternio, which makes possible a whole judgment. Okay, for those who are watching the video of this, I'll show you the image. All right, so that will probably clarify it. So the x-axis has the x-axis has causality on the left and synchronicity on the right. The y-axis has space at the top and time at the bottom, which forms 4 quadrants. But the quadrants aren't, the names aren't in each quadrant, but rather at the end of each scale. And the quadrants are made out of those 2 scales. The space-time scale and the causality synchronicity scale. I'm not sure what you'd call those. And I don't know what you'd call the 4 parts of the quaternio. I can't remember if Jung actually identifies labels for those 4 things. Speculating about that might be interesting, although keep in mind the labels are only, they're tools. They're not to be identified with or attached to too much. Here, synchronicity is to the 3 other principles as the one-dimensionality of time is to 3-dimensionality of space, or as a real recalcitrant 4th in the Timaeus, which Plato says can only be added by force to the other 3. Okay, so a footnote for time is, I'm not counting P.A.M. Dirac's multidimensionality of time, which might be interesting to look into. I haven't looked into it myself, I don't think. But the idea that time is multidimensional makes sense, I guess. There's a lot of dimensions from what I hear. A lot. So I mean, we're just grappling with coming to the 5th dimension. Like, the dimensions beyond that's we can take it one step at a time. As for the footnote 7, that's mostly German. Just as the introduction of time as the 4th dimension in modern physics postulates an irrepresentable space-time continuum, so the idea of synchronicity with its inherent quality of meaning produces a picture of the world so irrepresentable as to be quite baffling. Footnote. So James Jeans, Physics and Philosophy, page 215, thinks it possible, quote, that the springs of events in this substratum include our own mental activities, so that the fourth course of events may depend in part on these mental activities. The causalism of this argument does not seem to be, to me, altogether tenable. All right, so that's that last sentence wasn't part of the quote. That was just Jung's view. Interestingly, for what I hear, the fourth dimension isn't just time, that it's also linked to, it's mental, it's psychological in a sense. I've heard that in certain videos and certain things I've read about the Law of One and stuff and the Great Awakening. I can't recall where I saw it, but definitely I've come across this idea that the fourth dimension is a mental dimension. So if that were true, would that make time and mental phenomena? I mean, you would say that time is ultimately a creation of limitation and thus it's not real. And it's all hologram anyway, right? But for our experience to make sense, it being divided into time, for change to even occur, there has to be separation of a sort of separation that allows for time to exist. Or is it the self, the soul, being God, being a creator, when it creates, it changes. And that change that comes from creation manifests time as a natural product of creation. Because you can't change without a new state having occurred relative to what was already there. And that creates time, doesn't it? I don't know, but that seems to make sense to me. Just as the introduction of time as the fourth dimension of modern physics postulates an irrepresentable space-time continuum, so the idea of synchronicity with its inherent quality of meaning produces a picture of the world so irrepresentable as to be quite baffling. Although irrepresentable in the typical sense, the sense that's become typical in the modern world anyway. The advantage, however, of adding this concept is that it makes possible a view that includes the psychoid factor in our description and knowledge of nature, an a priori meaning or equivalence. The problem that runs like a red thread through the speculations of alchemists for 1500 years thus repeats and solves itself. The so-called axiom of Maria the Jewess, or Copt, quote, "Out of the third comes the one as the fourth." Footnote, that's from Psychology and Alchemy, New York and London, 1953, page 23. Or at least that's the translation, maybe? I'm not sure. This cryptic observation confirms what I've said above, that in principle, new points of view are not as a rule discovered in territory that is already known, but in out-of-the-way places that may be avoided because of their bad name, like hermetics. The old dream of the alchemist, the transmutation of chemical elements, is a much derided idea. This much derided idea has become a reality in our own day, and its symbolism, which was no less an object of ridicule, has turned out to be a veritable goldmine for the psychology of the unconscious. The dilemma of 3 and 4, which began as a story that serves as setting for the Timaeus and extends all the way to the Kabiri scene in Faust, Part 2, is recognized by a 16th century alchemist, Gerard Dorn, as the decision between the Christian Trinity and the serpens quadricorn the four-horned serpent who is the devil, as though in anticipation for things to come, he anathemizes the pagan quaternity, which was originally so beloved of the alchemists, on the ground that it arose from the binarius, the number two, and thus is something material, feminine, and devilish. Footnote, de tenebris contra naturam in the Theatrum Chemicum, Ursel, 1602, that's book one, I imagine, page 540. So why, I wonder, would that have been done? Now, I've got a theory that relates to relates to surface itself, beings shaping the cabal, essentially, or Illuminati, whatever you call it, shaping the beliefs of society and the norms of society. These are very powerful people, powerful interests, based on their interests. Now, why would, if there's a source of very valuable ideas which help people understand the true nature of reality, which synchronicity seems to be a feature of, and suppose it were known on some level that this were the case, but there was a threat to the establishment, well, it would make sense to just demonize it as devilish, right? If that's the paradigm of that has become the good and evil framework, then, I mean, it's interesting that the feminine was deemed as devilish. I mean, this is something that sky god belief systems. Now, interestingly, avians come from the quote sky. So this is an archon thing. This is a thing relating to the Anunnaki, I would say. So why is feminine energy a problem for the establishment? Why? Because the right brain is the feminine part of the psyche. We've all got masculine part and the feminine side in different, we've got a different balance of it, but we've got it. And when there's an imbalance between the masculine energies and the feminine energies, or the creative side, which is feminine, and the masculine side, which is more analytical, when there's an imbalance, or when it's shifted towards the analytical, what you get is the lack of creativity means less intuition. Less intuition means less access to the divine. And what that means is people go to authority to the divine to get the sense of the divine, rather than having a direct connection themselves, which suits the interests of the elites just fine. And so an anti-feminine alignment in society that seems to be put forth by, what type of religions are these? There's a word I'm looking for. Indo-European societies, less so Indian societies, I'd say, because of Hinduism, Vedic ideas. And so that, in my opinion, is why the material focus, that would be more left brain, and the feminine focus, no, that would be right brain. Interestingly, the material is actually more left brain, but it's portrayed here as linked to the feminine and the devilish. So this is convenience on this level. The feminine, obviously, portrayed negative, so that would actually make people less in touch with their spiritual side and more easy to control, more predictable as well, because while the left brain analytical side can be pretty useful, for sure. It's more ordered and it's easier to control if people are more like that. As for the devil, then what even is the devil? It's a combination of different concepts. It's a combination of the idea of Lucifer and the idea of the devil, Satan, that aren't even the same concept in the Bible. If you look at the Old Testament, there's people who've explained it in more detail than me, definitely. Satan doesn't, it's just absurd. It doesn't even exist. Lucifer did, but service to self does exist. Energies that are aligned with darkness and control, fear, hatred, etc. Obviously, that exists. Dr. Franz has demonstrated this emergence of Trinitarian thinking in the parable of Bernard of Treviso, in the Cohenrath's Ampit Theatrum, in Michael Mayer, and in the anonymous author of the Aquarium Sapientum. W. Portley calls attention to the polemical writings of Kepler and Robert Flood, in which Flood's correspondence theory was a loser and how to make room for Kepler's theory of the three principles. The decision in favor of freedom, which in certain respects ran counter to the alchemical tradition, was followed by a scientific epoch that knew nothing of correspondence and clung with a passionate insistence to a triadic view of the world, a continuation of the Trinitarian type of thinking, which described and explained everything in terms of space, time, and causality. I mean, the way it says, why would you limit it to three concepts? Like, why does it have to be three? I mean, there's nothing wrong with it being three, but there's no reason why it has to be. And this is science, right? But it's interesting that this is the legacy of science. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to say. The legacy of Christianity in the age of Pisces. It's also worth considering that the age of Pisces didn't need to have Christianity the way it turned out. It was just shaped that way. Another religion that we could identify as an age of Pisces religion is actually Buddhism. Perhaps, I think, or maybe Buddhism is slightly earlier. Actually, I'm not sure. Maybe Buddhism was slightly earlier than that. Anyway, that's just an idea. I'm not going to digress too much with that. Okay. The revolution brought about the discovery of radioactivity and has considerably modified the classical views of physics. So great is the change of standpoint that we have to revise the classical schema I made use of above. As I was able, thanks to the friendly interest of Professor Pauly evinced in my work, to discuss these questions of principle with a professional physicist who could at the same time appreciate my psychological arguments, I'm in a position to put forward a suggestion that takes modern physics into account. Pauly suggested replacing the opposition of space and time in the classical schema by the conservation of energy and the space-time continuum. This suggestion led me to a closer definition of the other pair of opposites, causality and synchronicity, with a view to establishing some kind of connection between these two heterogeneous concepts. We finally agreed on the following quaternio. So the x-axis is constant connection through effect, brackets causality, on the left. The right is inconstant connection through contingency, equivalence, or quote, meaning, or synchronicity. On the top of the y-axis, indestructible energy. On the bottom of the y-axis, space-time continuum. And if you're watching it, wait, There it is. Hopefully it's readable. Right. So what do I come up with when I see this? Space-time continuum instead of space. Well, I suppose if they're ultimately connected, then why separate them on the... And energy is completely missing from the first diagram. And it's of key importance, isn't it? So, yeah, I like that energy is in there. Energy, if you want to understand them, as Tesla said, if you understand the universe, think of energy and energy. Wow, I'm really delivering that well, huh? Think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. So, I mean, there being energy on there, that's pretty key. We know that energy is a key part of reality. I mean, even mainstream physics acknowledges it. So, This schema satisfies, on the one hand, the postulates of modern physics, and on the other hand, those of psychology. The psychological point of view needs clarifying. A causalistic explanation of synchronicity seems out of the question for the reasons given above. It consists essentially of chance, in inverted commas, equivalences. Its tertium comparationness rests on the psychoid factors I call archetypes. These are indefinite, which is to say that they can be known and determined only approximately as things stand. Although associated with causal processes or carried by them, they continually go beyond their frame of reference, an infringement to which I would give their name transgressivity, because the archetypes are not found exclusively in the psychic sphere, but they can occur in pretty much as much in circumstances that are not psychic, equivalents of an outward physical processes with a psychic one. Archetypal equivalences are contingent to causal determination. That is to say that there exists between them and the causal processes no relations that conform to law. They seem, therefore, to represent a special instance of randomness or chance, or of that random state that runs through time in a way that fully conforms to law, as Andreas Spacer says. Something in mind here is completely, synchronicity is actually consistent with the laws of reality in terms of the law of one. So, in fact, there may even be a law of synchronicity. I'm not sure about that, but I don't see, to me, I don't think it's random. It's a synchronicity, according to the synchronicity keeper, David Wilcock, it's certainly not random. It's divine. It's from source, of which we all are parts, right? And we, on the 3D, we cannot see the multidimensional threads that, it's like knitting or like sewing. There are these multidimensional threads sewn through this 3D reality. And we only, when we're seeing it in 3D, it looks random. But Jung acknowledged that this randomness had a pattern and seemed to be meaningful and yet non-caused. Perhaps it is non-caused, but to me, it seems to be caused by creative God power. Right? Or rather, manifestation, the law of attraction and the like. But certainly it seems to transgress the regular 3D perception of things anyway. And I wonder if archetypes are involved on this 3D level, are they involved beyond that? We don't know. Or at least I don't know. It is an initial state which is not governed by mechanistic law, but is the precondition of law, the chance substrate on which law is based. If we consider, actually that's actually interesting because this is like the underlying fabric of reality, and the laws that we see in 3D reality are kind of based on a more fundamental coding, perhaps. If we consider synchronicity or the archetypes as the contingent, holographic created reality, which has patterns, then the latter takes on the specific aspect of a modality that has the functional significance of a world constituting factor. The archetype represents psychic probabilities since it portrays ordinarily instinctual events in the form of types. It is a special psychic instance of probability in general, which is made up of quote, made up of the laws of chance and lays down rules for nature, just as the laws of mechanics do. We must agree with Spicer that although in the realm of pure intellect, the contingent is a formless substance, it reveals itself to psychic introspection so far as inward perception could grasp it at all, as an image or rather a type that underlies not only the psychic equivalences, but remarkably enough, the psychophysical equivalences too. It is difficult to divest conceptual language of its causal coloring. Thus, the word underlying, despite its causalistic connotation, does not refer to anything causal, but simply to an existing quality, an irreducible contingency, which is just so. Why is it the I am thing or the it is what it is thing? Being of isness. The meaningful coincidence or equivalence of a psychic and physical state that have no causal relationship to another means, in general terms, that it is a modality without a cause, an acausal orderness. An acausal orderness. The question now arises whether our definition of synchronicity with reference to equivalence of psychic and physical processes is capable of expansion, or rather requires expansion. This requirement seems to force itself upon us when we consider the above wider conception of synchronicity as an acausal orderedness. Into this category come all acts of creation, a priori factors such as the properties of natural numbers, the discontinuities of modern physics, etc. Consequently, we would have to include constant and experimentally reproducible phenomena within the scope of our expanded concept, though this does not seem to accord with the nature of the phenomena included in synchronicity narrowly understood. The latter are mostly individual cases which cannot be repeated experimentally, yet. This is not, of course, altogether true, as Ryan's experiments show, and numerous other experiences with clairvoyant individuals. These facts prove that even in individual cases which have no common measure, there are certain regularities and therefore constant factors from which we must conclude that our narrower conception of synchronicity is probably too narrow and really needs expanding. Well, that's good to hear. I incline, in fact, to the view that synchronicity in a narrow sense is in only a particular instance of general acausal orderedness, that namely of the equivalence of psychic and physical processes, where the observer is in the fortunate position of being able to recognize the tertium comparationis. But as soon as he perceives the archetypal background, he is tempted to trace the mutual assimilation of independent psychic and physical processes back to the causal effect of the archetype, and thus to overlook the fact that they are merely contingent. But obviously, this is looking at things in a more 3D way, and if we look at things in a more multi-dimensional way, perhaps we get beyond this tricky issue by there being a higher cause in a sense. This danger is avoided if one regards synchronicity as a special instance of the general acausal orderedness, though that might be a bit too convenient. In this way, we also avoid multiplying our principles of explanation illegitimately, for the archetype is the introspectively recognizable form of a priori cyclic orderedness. Let me read that again, actually. In this way, we also avoid multiplying our principles of explanation illegitimately, for the archetype is the introspectively recognizable form of a priori psychic orderedness. I suppose it is an order in the psyche, but it's not the only possible one, I don't think. So anyway. If an external synchronistic process now associates itself with it, it falls into the same basic pattern. In other words, it is too ordered. This form of orderedness differs from that of the properties of natural numbers or the discontinuities of physics, in that the latter have existed from eternity and occur regularly, whereas the forms of psychic orderedness are acts of creation in time. What is time if not acts of creation? That, incidentally, is precisely why I have stressed the element of time as being characteristic of these phenomena and called them synchronistic. Oh, close to the end. The modern discovery of continuity, e.g. the orderedness of energy quanta, of radium decay, etc., has put an end to the sovereign rule of causality and thus to the triad of principles. The territory lost by the latter belonged earlier to the sphere of correspondence and sympathy, concepts which reached to their greatest development in Leibniz's idea of the pre-established harmony. Schopenhauer knew far too little about the empirical foundations of correspondence to realize how hopeless his causalistic attempt at explanation was. I'm not sure I agree with that. Today, thanks to ESP experiments, we have a great deal of empirical material at our disposal. We can form some conception of its reliability when we learn from G.E. Hutchinson, footnote, S.G. Soul, S-O-A-L, that is, Science and Telepathy Inquiry, London 1, 1948. Where was I? When we learned from G.E. Hutchinson that ESP experiments conducted by S.G. Soul and K.M. Goldney have a probability of 1 to 10 to the power of 35. This being equivalent to the number of molecules in 250,000 tons of water. There are relatively few experiments in the field of natural sciences whose results come anywhere near to this degree of certainty. The exaggerated skepticism in regard to ESP is really without any shed of justification. Well, if you looked at Wikipedia, you would have thought otherwise, but there's probably a reason, because it challenges the establishment in some sense. The main reason for it is simply the ignorance which nowadays, unfortunately, seems to be the inevitable accompaniment of specialism that screens off the necessary limited horizon of specialist studies from all the higher and wider points of view in the most undesirable way. Well, one, perhaps the whole way the scientific community has been set up in that way has been deliberate, and the ignorance might be a fostered ignorance. How often have we not found that the so-called superstitions contain a core of truth that is well worth knowing? It may well be that the originally magical significance of the word wish, which is still preserved in wishing rod, divining rod, or magical wand, and expresses not just wishing in the sense of desire, but a magical action. Footnote. And the traditional belief in the efficacy of prayer are both based on the experience of concomitant synchronistic phenomena. Footnote. Jacob Grimm, Teutonic Mythology, translated by J.S. Stalibras, London 1883 to 88. 1, page 137. Wish objects are magic implements forged by dwarves such as Odin's spear, Gungnir, Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and Freya's sword. 2, page 870. Wishing is Gotteskraft, divine power. Ah, so Norse has some valuable truth in it. I wonder if that's some of the deliberate influence of the Palladians who are trying to help out in an indirect way. Perhaps, perhaps. Gott hast an sie den Wunschgelegt in der Wunschlaruten hot. God has bestowed the wish on her and the treasure of God has bestowed the wish on her and the treasure of, or found by, the wishing rod. So more German, which means to make beautiful with the power of the wish. Wish is Sanskrit manoratha, meaning car of the mind or of the psyche, i.e. wish, desire, fancy. Mano makes me think of mana, the manoratha. That's from MacDonald, A Practical Sanskrit Dictionary, London, 1924. That bit. So that's interesting. Yeah. So in Norse, there's some understanding of that. Reminds me of the law of attraction, honestly. Synchronicity is no more baffling or mysterious than the continuities of physics. It is only the it is only the ingrained belief in the sovereign power of causality that creates intellectual belief in that creates intellectual difficulties and makes it appear unthinkable that causeless events exist or could ever occur, or events caused by what's beyond 3 dimensions. But if they do, then we must regard them as creative acts. Well, I would think that seems quite apt. I would say creative in the sense of created by the creator, in the sense of source, in the sense of every single source, soul in existence, being part of the whole that is God. But I don't think that was intended by Jung. Regard them as creative acts, as a continuous creation of a pattern that exists from all eternity, repeats itself sporadically, and is not derivable from any known antecedents. We must, of course, so that, I mean, that seems consistent with the law of one, even if it's not meant to be. Now, I've got a footnote here that's quite long, so I'm going to read it out. Continuous creation is the to be thought of not only, continuous creation is to be thought of not only as a series of successive acts of creation, but also as the eternal presence of the one creative act. Wow, I mean, so source, right? In the sense that God was always the Father and always generated the Son. So Son the created. Is the Son the holographic reality and the Father the creation? Is Father Logos? But that would be the original word of God. Nah, it's getting a bit of a mix-up. I'm not sure. Or that he is the eternal creator of minds. God is entertained. God is contained in his own creation. Wow, sounds like panpsychism, law of one. Nor does he stand in need of his own works, as he had place in them where he might abide, but endures in his own eternity, where he abides and creates whatever pleases him, both in heaven and earth. What happens successively in time is simultaneous in the mind of God. An immutable, quote, an immutable order binds mutable things into a pattern. And in this order, things which are not simultaneous in time exist simultaneous outside of time. Quote, another quote, temporal succession is without time in the eternal wisdom of God, end quote. Before the creation, there was no time. Time only began with created things. Quote, rather did time arise from the created than the created from time. End quote. Quote, there was no time before time, but time was created altogether from the world, end quote. So, I mean, I could tell you all the different people he's quoting, but really that sounds like a bit of a chore, to be honest. This is page 142, if you have the book and you're going to find the references. Quote, there was no time before time, but time was created together with the world. We must, of course, guard against thinking of every event whose cause is unknown as causeless. This, as I have already stressed, is admissible only when a cause is not even thinkable. But thinkability is itself an idea that needs the most rigorous criticism. Had the atom, footnote, indivisible that cannot be cut, had the atom corresponded to the original philosophical conception of it, its fissionability would be unthinkable. But once it proves to be a measurable quantity, its non-fissionability becomes unthinkable. Meaningful coincidences are thinkable as pure chance, but the more they multiply and the greater and more exact the correspondence is, the more their probability sinks and their unthinkability increases, until they can no longer be regarded as pure chance, but for lack of a causal explanation, have to be thought of as meaningful arrangements. As I've already said, however, their inexplicability is not due to the fact that the cause is unknown, but due to the fact that a cause is not even thinkable in intellectual terms, or at least not in the regular sense or regular science. If you look at things and everything being one and the law of one, perhaps it is a bit more explicable. This is necessarily the case when space and time lose their meaning or become relative. For under those circumstances, a causality which presupposes space and time for its continuance can no longer be said to exist and becomes altogether unthinkable. A causality that presupposes space and time. I'm not sure about that, but it depends what space and time are and how we define them and how we understand them. For these reasons, it seems to me necessary to introduce, alongside space, time, and causality, a category which not only enables us to understand synchronistic phenomena as a special case of natural events, but also takes the contingent partly as a universal factor existing from all eternity, and partly as the sum of countless individual acts of creation occurring in time. Right. There's a resume, which seems to be kind of like a glossary, but not. It's basically giving us definitions. So I'll read it out for you. It's not that long. I've been informed that many readers find it difficult to follow my argument. Acausality and the idea of synchronicity as such, and also the astrological experiment, seem to present special difficulties in their understanding. And for this reason, I should like to make a few additional remarks in order to sum up these 3 points. 1. Acausality. If natural law were an absolute truth, then of course there could not possibly be any processes that deviate from it. But since causality is statistical truth, it holds good only on average and thus leaves room for exceptions which must somehow be experienceable, that is to say, real. I try to regard synchronistic events as causal exceptions of this kind. They prove to be relatively independent of space and time. They relativize space and time insofar as space presents, in principle, no obstacle to their passage, and the sequence of events and time is inverted, so that it looks as if an event which has not yet occurred were causing a perception in the present. But if space and time are relative, then causality too loses its validity, since the sequence of cause and effect is either relativized or abolished. Just because it's relativized, it doesn't mean it's not valid. That's my opinion anyway. 2. Synchronicity. During my express warning, I see that this concept has already been confused by the critics with synchronism. By synchronicity, I mean the occurrence of a meaningful coincidence in time. It can take 3 forms. A, the coincidence of certain psychic content with a corresponding objective process which is perceived to take place simultaneously. B, the coincidence of a subjective psychic state with a phantasm, brackets, dream or vision, close brackets, which later turns out to be a more or less faithful reflection of a synchronistic objective event that took place more or less simultaneously, but at a distance. C, the same except that the event takes place in the future and is represented in the past only by a phantasm that corresponds to it. Whereas in the first case, an objective event coincides with a subjective content, the synchronicity in the other 2 cases can only be verified subsequently, though the synchronistic event as such is formed by the coincidence of the coincidence of a neutral psychic state with a phantasm, dream or vision. 3. At the astrological experiment. The 50 possible aspects to be considered in a marriage relationship were examined statistically. The result shows that in 3 quite fortuitously assorted batches of marriage horoscopes, the greatest frequency fell to 3 different lunar conjunctions. The probability of these figures is far from being significant because if we take the number of marriage horoscopes, there is always a 1 to 1,500 probability of our getting a similar result. Even so, this probability is not so great that we could expect a repetition of the same result in the second batch, for the probability of this already amounts to 1 to 1,500 squared. This figure is so high that a repetition of the first result must be regarded as extremely improbable. It is now, if it is now repeated for a 3rd time, there is a sufficient ground for assuming a synchronistic phenomenon. The probability here amounts to 1 to 2,500,000. In addition, the lunar conjunctions I have mentioned are not just any conjunctions, but correspond to 3 main pillars of the horoscope and appear in that order. Now I'm going to attempt to say what these symbols represent, but I don't know what one of the symbols means. So moon to sun, moon to moon, moon to ascending. Furthermore, these lunar conjunctions are the classical aspects for marriage. The meaningful arrangement is an exceedingly improbable one. It looks like a conscious fraud, and its calculation was bedeviled by all manner of unconscious tendencies to twist the result in favor of astrology and synchronicity, despite there being a contrary tendency in the conscious minds of the persons responsible. So, here we are. I don't think I'll read out the index. So that's it. I enjoyed reading it again. I got a lot of it, and I was inspired in content additional to the book itself, which is good. And I must emphasize that those are my opinions. The stuff I added, that is. And I admit I wasn't 100% clear all the time what was my opinion and what was reading out from the book. That was just my style of delivery. But that's just how I did it. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. I feel like this book is it's a puzzle piece. It's a piece of the puzzle. And certainly we can see how this inspired David Wilcock. I don't think there's any way the only inspiration of David Wilcock, but it does seem to have inspired him. And we can see how, because understanding what we see in this book and the evidence there, understanding it in context of other things we understand, we start to get a picture of what David Wilcock understands. And with that as well in mind, we really have a better picture of the overlap between science and mysticism and how that can help us understand reality and present a picture of the world which is, what's the word? That's believable, right? That is actually sounds plausible to people in the contemporary times. Although as things get weirder during this age of Aquarius, because past the threshold, but the full effects, it's going to take time to really play out. And of course, people might say, well, of course you'd say that, right? Yeah, I suppose so. We'll see. We'll see. And in any case, the more that happens, the more frequency raises, the more people start to piece things together. And I'm by no means, I don't even know how I've managed to piece things together as well as I have, which is itself probably my ego speaking to some extent. But to the extent that I know I've got a lot more progress to make, right? I know, like, I've got a lot of inner work, shadow work to do, but I can make sense of that book and its contents and fairly well, and I'm surprised. And so I don't know why I'm mentioning that really, but I suppose I don't think it's so complicated as it seems. It's just not the way people are used to thinking about things. And I feel like it's going to increasingly feel more intuitive and plausible. Well, I haven't said everything I was going to say, I don't think, but I think that's all right. I think that's all right. I'm starting to get a picture of things, and it shows that even without, how was it? I suppose even without learning about this stuff is helpful, even if your frequency isn't necessarily that high. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who are more awakened than me, for sure, definitely. And I guess these comparisons don't really matter. I hope people enjoy it fundamentally, and I hope people learn from it. And this process of podcasting, I'm really enjoying. It's something I love doing, even if my heart isn't consistently open all the time or whatever. And I'm doing work on dealing with negative emotions, which everyone do, I suppose, to some extent. Yeah, I would say I imagine it should be enjoyable to people receptive to it, just because I'm doing what I enjoy and that must come through. Although at times when I was reading this, some of the mathematical formulas or some of the formulas were in a format that I wasn't familiar with. So that might not have come off so intuitive. But yeah, I feel like this is a good set of episodes. I'm happy with it. So yeah, bye for now.